Good morning, everyone. I'm Tracy Noah from the Marion Library Service, and welcome to our Library Through the Lens live webinar, part of our series of adult programs delivered differently. This morning, we welcome special guest presenter, Lisa von Alpen, a writer and poet of both the written and performed variety, an English and history high school teacher, and a sub-editor for Tulpa magazine. Lisa will help you learn techniques for writing scenes that genuinely hook, hold, and pull your readers into your narrative. Please feel free at any time during the presentation to type questions you have for Lisa into the chat feed on your screen. She will answer these during a short Q&A break later on and also at the end of her presentation. Now sit back, get your pens and paper ready, and please welcome Lisa.
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? If you can, please just type something in the chat, preferably something nice and friendly would be good. Excellent, good. Look at the comments rolling in. Wonderful. Okay, I can see a few familiar names, which is wonderful. Welcome back, Brittany. Lovely. Excellent, okay. All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see again some familiar names and also some new ones too. And thank you personally for choosing to spend your time doing something so productive and fun. That is creative writing. I'm very, very big fan. And whether or not you're new to this or pretty experienced, there's something in this workshop I've designed probably for everyone. So that's the goal here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. So hopefully shortly you will be able to see my PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, can you all see my PowerPoint okay? Should say writing riveting scenes. Excellent, good news. All right, okay, let's set this all up then. Okay. Okay, now I've just gone full screen and sometimes it will boot out the full screen from your screen. So just one more time, can you see the screen okay? Don't want to get halfway through and then realize you can't see anything I'm talking about. Look like a crazy lady. Wonderful. Okay, let's get started. So, welcome everyone. Just to give you a little bit of context as to who I am, as Tracy said, my name is Lisa von Alpen. She's covered pretty much everything. The only thing I could add to you is that if you would like to find me on any platform available that's most common, that I'm on the most, it would probably be Instagram. That's where a lot of my readership and following comes from. You can find me under @LisaJadePoetry, and my name is spelled a little bit unusually, so feel free to note that down and connect with me later. I'm always happy to try and promote you as a budding writer or even an experienced one. I was there, I know what it's like. And I really, really love just the concept of writing, not just poetry, but young adult novels and a whole series of different things. So really, really love this stuff, guys. All right, let's go to the next slide if it'll let me. Okay, so the structure for today's webinar will be thus. So we cover a little bit of everything to do with writing a really gripping and engaging scene. And there's actually a lot of ingredients involved in this mix. So part of that is gripping characters. So we sort of debunk this idea of the 2D protagonist and we move towards a 3D protagonist. Dialogue is really important as well. We'll ideally have a break at approximately around 10:50 to 11ish, and it'll be about 10 minutes. And as Tracy said, you can feel free to ask questions or go to the loo, get a drink, that sort of thing. After then, we're going to look at appealing to the senses and imagery and then structuring scenes. So I've left sort of the tedious part of it until towards the end, but I've tried to still make it engaging. Structuring scenes is actually a little bit more fun than what it sounds like. It's I call it the bones of the scene because it is it's the foundation, but you can have all of your stuff ready and then go back and edit it is just what I usually prefer to do, probably because it's a bit more engaging, but that's just my preference. Okay, and then at the end, more questions and feedback would be good too, if you wish. Okay, so starting off with gripping characters, which I refer to as the heart of the scene. So if you think about some of your favorite novels or favorite poems or even movies, it doesn't have to just be a written text. I think personally what I reflect on the most is not just the story, that's really powerful, make no mistake about that, but it's actually characters that we tend to fall in love with, and it's characters that we tend to relate to, and it's characters that tend to really sort of shake us and wake us up. So it's actually a really powerful thing to have a really relatable character that we can just connect with. So, oh, and a heads up, if you are a reoccurring participant in my webinars, some of this we have covered before, but it's great recap for you, and it's all necessary for creating a riveting scene to have a gripping character. So just letting you know, you're veterans at this point if you've come back again. So the 2D protagonist. This is something that I didn't really think about when I first started writing. I thought, oh, it doesn't matter if I have minor characters that are 2D, that doesn't matter. The point is that the main protagonist, that, you know, he or she, they are engaging, and I don't really care about the rest. But it's actually really important that your whole cast of characters, whoever's in that scene, are not 2D. And the reason why is because 2D characters are really flat and boring. So to define 2D for you, if we think about, if I get a piece of paper, if I think about this cardboard here, 2D is really just, it's flat. There's nothing to it. If you turn it to the side, it's really, really thin. But 3D, as we know, is what we look like. It's sort of this all-encompassing shape. It's got a lot of layers, and we can really flesh that out. So when we talk about a 2D protagonist, really we shouldn't be talking about a 2D protagonist because they should not exist. And your minor characters, they shouldn't really be 2D either. So what this looks like in a scene is that they're not flat, they're not boring, their dialogue isn't dropping, they are believable, they are engaging, and they're relatable. And if they're not any of those things, then you have a 2D protagonist, unfortunately, which really isn't that engaging at all. So an example of this that I've said in the past is this idea of a perfect woman or a perfect man with no flaws, and they just have the best qualities of everything. You know, they can do this and they can do that, and they can kick ass and take on the world, and they're amazing. But personally, me as a writer and an avid reader, I can't relate to that at all. So I will automatically switch off, even if I admire that character. And that's not what you want. What a lot of writers tend to do, which is really clever nowadays, is they actually take cliches like this, like a perfect woman or man, and they flip it on its head, which is really interesting. So they start off with a 2D character, and then it turns out they're really layered, and perhaps they appear perfect because their flaw is that they are a perfectionist, and behind the scenes, they actually crumble a lot. That's a bit different. That's adding layers. You don't just want a 2D protagonist all the way through. So avoid this wherever you can. So if this is the case, then how can we write a scene that demonstrates a 3D character that's really highly quite immersive? Well, there's a lot of writing on the screen, but I'll break it down for you. It's essentially you want emotional responses, because that's pretty relatable to a lot of people, having an emotional response, even if that's impulsive sometimes. Motivations, goals, and conflict, which we cover in a bit of depth shortly. Dialogue needs to flow. In fact, I was just covering this with my students yesterday during our double of English for my year 11s. We were going through dialogue quite a bit, and this idea of having different ways that you can lay out dialogue. And I've got a really bad example of dialogue later in the slides, which I'll try not to cringe too much when I read for you. So when you combine all of this together, you can have a really gripping character. So let's see what some of that looks like. So before we go into dialogue or a lot of emotion or anything like that, we need to understand your character, don't we? We need to know what makes them tick, what they want, what they desire, what's in their way. So in the writing world, we call this character building, and to get really specific, it's called GMC. So GMC means goal, motivation, conflict. So what do they want? Why do they want it? What will they overcome to get it? What actually stands in their way? So the what they want is the goal. Why they want it is what's driving them. It's motivating them. And what they need to overcome is usually the conflict of the story, which sort of, if we think about, for example, this is getting very technical, but if we think of Freytag's pyramid, so it looks like that, it's a triangle, that's a story arc. So we have beginning, rising action, climax, falling action, end. And the conflict usually sits in the whole way of the pyramid and is most highest at the peak. And that conflict should directly sort of smash against what your character wants. So if we look at this in a little bit more detail on the slide I have here for you, Goals and motivations need to be clear. They're important to your character. They're not just I'd like this, but I could go without it. It's actually really tied into their core. It's pushing them. They need to have this thing done. They want it so badly. Personally, I don't know if you can relate to this. I can relate to that. There are things I want in life so badly, and I'll do anything to overcome any obstacle to get there. And when I see that in a character, I immediately get sucked in because I think, yes, I can relate to that, even if it's nothing to do with what I want. Just that motivation in general, that want, that drive, and that conflict in the way, that's enough to hook me. And you'll find with your readers, that's enough to hook them too. Another hot tip as well for this is that usually the goal and the motivation and the conflict should all be pretty time sensitive. So you'll often find in a lot of novels that there's a certain amount of time delineated to the character that they have until they can't reach this goal anymore. And that's one of the best ways to do it. It's not necessarily a cliche if you can spin it in a way that makes it engaging, but it is a really good way to hook your readers as well. So if we think about external conflicts like the world or something that's happened or opinions of other characters, those are things that your character really can't control. So they're external kinds of conflicts. And then you have internal kinds of conflicts. So for example, challenging their own values, a lack of experience, being protective, fear, regret. You'll find with a lot of novels these days, they really break sort of previous records and talk about just anything, which is really good to see. So we see a lot of novels nowadays talking about mental health, talking about repressed sexuality, talking about a lot of things like this. And these are often things called internal conflict, which can be just as interesting as natural disasters, political commentation, that kind of thing. So really it's whatever you want to put into your novel, but we need to play it up as a conflict that actually matters, not a minor inconvenience to your character, something that actually grips us and shakes us awake. Okay, so there's a classic example on the slide for you here, Romeo and Juliet. I've just gone through this with my year 10s and they're making short films based around this, and they need to capture the essence of GMC. So the goal here is that Romeo and Juliet want to be together because they've fallen in love. Falling in love is the motivation behind them wanting to be together. That makes sense. And then the conflict is actually family hatred. So that is actually known as external conflict because it's not actually something they can control. Okay, so hopefully that's a good example for you. And there are very few instances in which you would ever break this process. Now, my friend Murray Curtis, who also does presentations for City Marion Library events, he's wonderful. I fully recommend him. He and I have had so many conversations about, no, you need to break the mold in writing. And I completely agree. Go against the grain, go against the rules, but you need to have a purpose for doing that. So for example, a character like Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean, the fun is actually not knowing what his motivation is sometimes, or not knowing what his end goal actually is, or not knowing the real conflict rather than the portrayed conflict. And that's okay, because the whole point of his character is to be fun, mysterious, elusive, gripping, that kind of thing. So that is okay, but you need to have a purpose for not, letting your audience in, letting your readers in to know why this might be the case. So that's one of the only instances in which I would argue that's okay. And I'm sure Murray would agree with me. And if he doesn't, this is not his presentation, so don't tell him. Okay, another really big thing to keep in mind too is, say you're doing a scene and the scene that you really want to do is actually, it's nothing to do with your protagonist. Say it's something to do with your antagonist and you're writing that and it's from their perspective. They're still a character. They actually still need GMC. They still need to be believable and layered. I think just the other night I was thinking to myself, what are some really good villains and why do I like them so much? I am a huge comic book nerd. I love books. I love highly theoretical debates, but I really love comic books. And if any of you are a fan of Marvel or DC, you will know that a lot of their villains are actually really well put together. They're really well written. They have backstories, they have motivations, and they're not really surface level, which is what we want. We want to go beyond that superficiality and dive into the layers, dive into the relatability. So for example, who was I thinking of just the other day? This is not the best example, I'm fully aware of that, but the Joker, so from the DC universe, absolute wacko, wouldn't ever like him as a person, 100%. But when you actually dive into part of his backstory, you think, actually, that's really in depth. And a lot of the things you do can be explained because of this. He's not a jerk or a crazy guy just for the sake of having a character like that. There's actually a lot of reasons why psychologically he ended up like that. And I won't say anything in case you don't know why. But that's the purpose of GMC. We need to understand that when you have a character, you're not dealing with just this flat object. You're dealing with a person. You're giving life, you're breathing life into a person that needs to be relatable, whether or not they're a good or a bad guy. Okay. So this is all well and good, but how do we use singular characters individually to create character chemistry in a scene? How do we bring them together? And this is where the emotion and dialogue comes in. So, for example, classic line, I don't know how many times this would have been hammered into you if you're in like a repeated writer, like you keep writing and writing and writing and so on, or if you're new to writing, but a classic golden rule of writing is show, don't tell. Some of my students in year 12 still have trouble with this, and I've been hammering it with them since year 10, but it's really worth trying to wrap your head around. So for example, say I was writing a scene and I wanted to show that my character was hella angry. They're so angry. I wouldn't say Sarah is angry. That's a little bit simplistic. That's more sort of, I suppose, picture book sort of level. Whereas if we explain how she's angry, we don't just label the emotion. We say, for example, she gnawed her lips, she clenched her fists, that kind of thing. That's showing over telling, and that's what we want. So I always say it like this to my students and to all attendees and workshops that I have. You don't want to spoon feed your readers, but you don't want to be too broad either. So when you label something, if you go, she's angry, well, people experience anger in different ways. So I don't know what kind of anger you experience. When I get really angry, I actually spit fire words out and I sound amazing. But then I also sometimes stutter. And sometimes if I get really, really angry, which rarely ever happens, I'll get so frustrated that I cry, I angry cry. So I don't know how you would show anger, but that's my experience. So if I was to write something as simplistic as Sarah was angry, that's what I imagine. But that's probably not what you imagine. So if I want to give you a specific image, I need to be specific with the body language that my character conveys. So I would explain that. I'd say she clenched her teeth, or she, I don't know, she pulled her hair or something, you know, but you be very specific in this instance. But also, again, you don't want to label. You want your readers to figure out what it is that the character feels so that they can connect with it. And also, FYI, it's really rewarding when we figure things out for ourselves. It makes us feel pretty smart, and then we can piece things together bit by bit. So again, don't be too broad, and you need to show and not tell. So some physical signs of perhaps nervousness, for example, might be the biting of the lips. And then you can couple that with a mental response. So if you're not familiar with this, I'll explain it now. A mental response or internal dialogue, we use these terms to simply mean just thoughts, internal thoughts of your character. Now, when your character is thinking, they're having an internal thought or monologue or whatever, it's in italics. So if you've ever read a book and you go, oh, why is this in italics when they're using the first person pronoun? I don't understand. It's because it's an internal dialogue. So I might say, for example, Sarah chewed her lip. I can't do this, comma, she said, or she thought. Sorry, it should be she thought to herself. And that's internal dialogue. So you can couple physical signs with mental streams of thought, and that's actually pretty powerful because that's what we do. You're just describing what people do in real life and breathing that life into your character, giving the heart of the scene some real beats per se. You can also show long-term signs of physical responses to things. So for example, they might not be biting their nails in the scene, but you might be able to have your protagonist pick up on watching when they move their fingers. John's fingers are actually bitten, the nails are bitten down to the quick. So that must mean he's pretty stressed on the regular, or just chews his nails a lot. So you can have those little hints and feed them to your audience. And sometimes this is really good for a bit of subtext. If you're not familiar with that, it's sort of like a story within your story. It's sort of like how do I explain it? It's like if you have your main storyline and then beneath the scenes, you've actually been dropping little hints about two other people that are going to end up together or someone who's going to die or something like that. And it's almost like a bit of foreshadowing. And then at the end, you get there and you go, oh, I missed all those hints because I was looking at the main storyline. And that's actually really clever. A lot of detective and crime and thriller novels do this, and it works really, really well. And then you go back and you read the book and you can appreciate it on a whole other level. You were reading this one, but you missed this and this and this, and that's really clever. So sometimes showing and not telling even just little subtle things outside your protagonist is a really good way to add flavor to your story. Okay, and then the last kind of show don't tell, if it's not immediately happening in the scene and you can't observe it as being an ongoing thing, like nails bitten down to the quick and so on, or like a blistered lip from having it being gnawed or chewed or bit so much, would be suppressed emotion. So it's still happening in the scene, but you're not actually letting it surface too much. It's really subtle. So here an example of suppressed emotion would be wiping hands on pants to get rid of physical signs of nervousness. Whereas something more explicit would be, you know, like chewing the lip. That's a bit too obvious. But if you just sort of like move your hands around, gently pat them on your pants, that's a bit more subtle. So that's really interesting. Okay, and then last point for character emotion and chemistry on this slide is when you have an emotion with your character, you need it to be strong if the scene is intense. So I remember I was such a polite writer. Is anyone here a polite writer? It's where you don't want to essentially make your readers feel annoyed towards your character. So I wouldn't ever want to, you know, give them an opinion that was too offensive, or because that the character doesn't represent you. That's something that people confuse, is that when you write a character, you're not slipping and staying into their shoes. You're just showing that you can write about a character. So I might write an antagonist that I absolutely hate, and that's half the fun, is that you can just show what a bad person they are, but it doesn't mean you relate to them. So you can do the same thing with your protagonist. And I never wanted to write a character that would have been really annoying as a protagonist, but that's actually what makes them relatable. No, you don't want to make them too offensive, because yes, your audience will switch off if they're a protagonist because they won't be a good role model. So you need to be careful, but I wouldn't want to go too far. So something I never used to do, because I don't like it when people do this in real life, is I hate you, or you suck in an argument. But that's just what happens in arguments. And then you need to fix it later. And that's part of the conflict in a story, and that's the suspense. So I used to be a really polite writer. But the moral of this story is that if you're having an intense argument in a book, then your character needs to have an intense response. So, for example, it would be great if all our characters were composed, but that's not how it works in the real world. And it actually doesn't teach your readers very much either. So, for example, as a teacher, I'm very big on giving moral lessons where I can to my students. But I mean, readers are smart, students or not. They can pick up when you are force-feeding morals down their throat. So if you show what it's like to make a mistake by going, I hate you, you know, I wish we never got together, or something like that, and then they come back later and fix that, the fixing part there is actually more valuable than you not having that to begin with. So when you have an argument in a novel, don't be polite. Don't be afraid to come back later and fix it up if it gets too intense, but it shouldn't be, oh, I really dislike you right now, Johnny. I really dislike you. It should be, I hate you. It should be emphatic. You shouldn't be afraid to do that. And that's character, emotion, and chemistry. A little bit more on this as well is that when you have a moment of high tension, as we're talking about, maybe not an argument, but maybe a character is dying, then it makes sense to have a lot of additional emotion shown instead of just spoken. So for example, how could I explain this? You read in classic YA, so that's young adult novels, and it still happens in adult novels too, but you'll find it's incredibly more so prevalent in young adult novels, this sense of drama. Teenagers are pretty dramatic. Let's be real. I work with them. I love them. I love my job, but they can be really dramatic. Even as adults, we can be dramatic, but teenagers are especially so. It's emotionally turbulent for them. Their bodies are changing. They're figuring out who they are. And when you read, for example, young adult novels, you see this drama really heightened. So for example, as an adult, ideally the way we deal with someone dying is, that's really hard. Let's talk through this. But a teenager might run off into the distance and scream bloody murder and then collapse on a beach. And I know that sounds really quite hectic, as the kids would say, but that's kind of what a teenager would really do, wouldn't they? So don't be afraid to put that into your story. That's okay. Adults could sometimes still do this if it really badly affects them. And while we might read that and go, huh, I'd never do that, that's weird, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're talking about it later. We go, oh man, that was a very heavy scene, but they're talking about it. So my advice for this would be, don't be afraid to go too far and then just pull back in editing. It's okay to be dramatic. Stories are a heightened version of reality. They're not supposed to be exactly as things are told. If you've ever read an autobiography, I can guarantee you some things have been polished and heightened, because not everyone's life is interesting all the way through. And that's okay, that's fine. But it's okay to dramatize some things, especially when it comes to character emotion and their responses to that emotion. Okay. So that's some things about emotion. What about dialogue? I'm going to read to you a very poor example of dialogue. Feel free to read along with me or close your eyes and listen to this. I'm going to try and read this in a way that's not monotonous. It will be a little bit difficult. So here we go. Hey, can you come here for a second? Said Marty. Yeah, sure, said Martha. Okay, cool. Could you please read this assignment that I've been working on? Said Marty. Yeah, sure, said Martha. Okay, cool, thanks, said Marty. No problem, said Martha. Really appreciate it, said Marty. It's fine, said Martha. Can someone please post in the chat, before I blow my top, what is wrong here? What is wrong with this dialogue? Why is it a poor example of dialogue? We have the grammatical punctuation, that's all correct. There seems to be a tiny bit of flow, but what's wrong? Why is this not interesting? Curious to see what you will think in the chat. Said too often, absolutely correct. Thanks, Travis. Too much of nothing, excellent. That's right, Danielle, there's not a lot of substance here. What else is wrong as well? I'm looking for something very specific. Dialogue tags, correct. We need more substance to do with a lot of different elements in this particular stream of dialogue. And just in case no one picked up on this as well, there's too many filler words in here as well. So filler words are, for example, like, that sort of thing. Those are filler words and filler phrases, and we don't actually want them in your dialogue. So I'm going to expand on that now. So I'll just go to the next slide. When you write your dialogue, it should be natural, that's true, but better. So again, you cut out all the boring stuff, no filler words. Now, I said to my year 11s yesterday, and I've said this in previous workshops, the only reason why you would put in a filler word or a filler phrase is to actually make a point, make a statement. So let's say, for example, that I have a character called, I'm going to steal Brittany's name if that's okay, Brittany. Sorry about this. Let's say we have a character called Brittany, lovely young lady, but she is incredibly anxious at points. Let's just say that's my character. I can relate to that. I used to be incredibly anxious. Let's say she's really anxious. And the whole point of the scene that I'm writing is, okay, now I want to convey that my character Brittany sometimes gets anxious. So maybe that means she will trail off in conversation. Maybe that means she will say, when people ask her questions instead of answering. That's okay, because it's then not a filler word, it's to demonstrate her characterization. That's okay. But when you're having dialogue in general, we don't want this sort of stuff. That's far too boring. And every single word that you write in a book, in a poem, in song lyrics, they matter. They absolutely matter, especially in a scene that you're trying to make riveting, gripping. So avoid filler words where possible, unless it's to convey a point. I've listed here as well on the second dot point on the slide, you can experiment with dialogue and use it to foreshadow or provide subtext. So for example, there is a great book, and I won't tell you what it is because then it ruins part of it for you. And I'm so sorry if you do pick it up in the next week and you're like, no, I know what's going to happen now. There's a great book that I love by an Australian author, and I missed a lot of the subtext and foreshadowing that she put in there. And as I went back and read it again, there's a really horrible thing that happens at the end of the novel. And in her dialogue, she goes, man, I hate this sort of thing. And then it actually happens later, and you lose it because it's only one little comment at the beginning of the book, and then it happens. So it seems unimportant, but again, every piece of dialogue, every word that you have outside of dialogue, it all matters. So you can use that to foreshadow and provide subtext and flavor, different layers to your story. Dialogue's actually incredibly important, so very good stuff. On the topic of avoiding filler words, you want to also avoid small talk. So again, every word, every sentence matters. So unless it's relevant to providing a point, just don't have the dialogue. Monologues as well are pretty average. So a dialogue is where two or more people are talking back and forth. A monologue is where just one person is talking, and either there are one or more people listening, or it's just them sort of talking by themselves. Fun fact for you, in a play, when someone's talking by themselves and no one else can hear, it's called a soliloquy, but we usually just call them monologues in the writing world of novels. And they're really, really average. So what we mean by this is that it's great to hear a lot of the streamlined thought processes of a character, but it's actually more interesting when we figure out what their motives are, when we figure out this, when we figure out that through their actions, rather than just having an info dumped on a page. That's not quite as interesting. So again, it's sort of like filtering out different points we want our readers to figure out. Treat your readers like they are smart, especially if you're writing an adult novel. Don't spell things out for them. I find that so frustrating as a reader, as a writer as well, when I read a novel and I go, oh, well, I could have figured that out, actually. You didn't need to spoon feed that to me. So don't be afraid to provide a little bit of complexity. Plus, when you finish a novel or a scene or whatever, and you hand it to a friend, or in the writing world, a beta reader, we call them. So that's before we publish anything. We choose a select number of people. We go, will you please be a beta reader for me? Sort of like a beta tester in the gaming world. And that's where they read things before anyone else does, and they give you feedback. And those beta readers, or your editor, if you end up with an editor, they will tell you if it's not interesting. So that's okay. Don't be, or if it's too complex is what I should have said. So don't be afraid to go too far rather than not enough. Awesome. Oops. Let's go back to the next slide. Great. This next point is hugely important. If we go back to this poor example of dialogue, note that it's just, as was conveyed in the chat before, it's just said. There's no action in here at all to break up the dialogue. There's filler words. It's just a really, I don't even want to talk about it. It's just not a good excerpt of writing. But when we look here at the second to last dot point on this slide, providing facial expressions, behavior can all add flavor to an engaging scene. So for example, if I was going to say, I'll borrow Travis's name if that's all right with you, Travis. Let's say that Travis was having a conversation with Danielle. So maybe Travis and Danielle are talking. And instead of going said, maybe Danielle can tuck her hair behind her ear. Maybe Travis can lean forward and then press his forefinger to his chin and ponder. So when you put things in a dialogue, you shouldn't be afraid to put in action as well, because that provides us with more imagery. We can imagine more of what's happening rather than just said. And I have examples of what this looks like later too. On the idea of said repetitively, I want to point something out. It is totally okay for you to put said a lot, because said actually becomes a skimming word. So we just skim over that. And what becomes really important is what's in the dialogue tags, what's in the quotation marks. That's okay. Said has a very specific function, but you shouldn't use it all the time, especially if you're conveying a point about emotion. So we come back to that character chemistry. If we have, for example, two people or more having an argument, if we just have said, then we lose the flavor of that argument. It becomes really dry, bland, and is it even really an argument if they're not shouting or spitting or hissing words at each other? So using different verbs other than said, such as spat or hissed or shouted or whispered, anything like that, that provides more power and grip to your scene, and that'll hook your readers more. So that's okay. All right, so this next slide as well is a whole series of words that you could use instead of said. So I've shown this slide before to previous attendees and they've really liked it. So I hope that you do as well. These are just some. There are so many. If you just type into Google, if you do a bit of research, or if you just note down really nice verbs that you enjoy from books, you can collect and accumulate a whole list of words other to use besides said. But you never, ever want to overdo this. So just like you wouldn't go said, you wouldn't put in all these different verbs. You only use a word other than said to convey a powerful point. So let's go through some of them now. So instead of said, you could say, for example, replied. That's pretty straightforward. Groaned, snapped, sobbed, cried, mumbled, shouted, insisted, stuttered, murmured, repeated, whispered, coughed, hissed, agreed, retorted, laughed, gushed. There's so many different words that you can use, but you only use them when you want to convey that emotion. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so when we think of some ways to physically lay out, so structure-wise, ways that you can write dialogue, here are some examples of perhaps one character speaking. So here I've done third person for the first 2 dot points and then first person for the third. So you could have dialogue tag, comment, whatever's being said, and then you have the comma. By the way, punctuation-wise, you actually put the comma before the end dialogue tag. That often confuses people, but you do it before the end dialogue tag, and then you put whoever said it, or if they retorted or something like that. Second one is broken up between, so this is called chunking. So this is where you have something being said, who says it, and then the rest of what they say. That's pretty appealing to the eye if you've got a long bit of dialogue. It's a good way to break that up. Third dot point is actually a really powerful way to deliver dialogue, which is often overlooked, and you see it rarely done in books for a good purpose. Usually it's because it is a bit, it sort of derails how you're reading a little bit, so it kind of jars you, but you use it for a specific effect. So for example, let's say that I was going to say to my students, I'm moving schools, which undoubtedly would make them cry. I'm pretty proud to say that. Let's say that I wanted to deliver it in a way that was really soft and gentle. So what if I wanted to say to them, I'm moving schools? You don't know that I'm going to say that in that way unless that way comes first. So if you want your readers to read it as it's about to be said softly, you need to say that before what's being said is said. I've read in so many novels, unfortunately, where I read a line and I imagine it in my head the way I think it's read, and then afterwards it's actually been shouted. And I go, oh, well, I imagined it as just spoken at usual room volume. So it loses the power, and then I've got to go back and read it again. It interrupts flow. So the best way to deliver a really strong point in an emotion that you want to convey really quickly without interrupting the flow and the grip of your scene is to put in dialogue like this. So these are the 3 main ways that you can use to break up dialogue. And in fact, if you remove the dot points, this could just be a conversation between 2 people. So maybe, for example, if I scroll up in the chat, let's use someone else's name, Chloe. Let's say that Chloe is talking to Jenny. So Chloe's talking to Jenny and they're talking back and forth. So maybe blah, blah. Chloe said blah. Jenny said blah, blah. Chloe then whispered blah, blah. So, you know, it can be an exchange of dialogue, not just these one-offs that you can use in a scene. Okay. Now, I'll really briefly go through this because I feel like a lot of us sort of get it at this point, but this is a little excerpt of a novel that I was writing a little while ago, and I put down because I've been focusing on my poetry for quite a while. But this is just a really straightforward way to show you how this dialogue and action works while conveying a little bit of emotion, not too much. So I'll read it to you and we'll chat about it. It's not too long. It's not even that bad, Shani said, swatting Malin's fingers away. Malin raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? She tugged the bandage tighter around her cousin's swollen ankle. Shani yelped. Pursing her lips, Malin muttered, You were saying? Shani swallowed. Okay. I suppose it's a little puffy. Your ankle is the size of Amma's temper. Shani giggled and sighed before leaning back on her elbows in the fur skins lining her bed. Nothing is as big as that, she said. Malin dared to smile. I wouldn't call you a liar for that, Shan. So, if we have a look at this dialogue exchange here, note that it's not constantly she said this, she said that. It's Malin pursed her lips and muttered. So we have Malin muttered. So we have MM, that's alliteration in the writing world. So that's a literary device to help you pay attention to those words. And then Shani swallows. So we have an action here. And then it's implied that she's the one talking. There's nothing there that says she said or she whispered or anything. It's just she does an action and the dialogue follows straight away after the action. So we know it's her talking because no one else is in that line. We go to a new line, and then Malin says, your ankle is the size of Emma's temper. Excuse me. Now we know it's Malin talking without any she said this or Malin said that because Shani's spoken. There's new dialogue tags. It's not continued. And there's only 2 people in this scene. So we know it has to be Malin. So you don't have to even constantly have those dialogue tags attached with the verbs. You don't need to do that. You can just have it back and forth, and that's completely fine and can actually assist in flow. So again, it's whatever you're comfortable doing and your preference as a writer, because this is your work. It's what you prefer to do. It's your writing style. And that's what makes, books so interesting. I might pick up something by John Green and then pick up something by, for example, I know so many authors and I've gone completely blank. I don't know, Stephen King or something. They're completely different and I like them for different reasons. So it's really up to you. So you don't have to write the way I'm writing here. It's really up to you. Now I'm only looking at the chat occasionally, but Travis said you used italics. I did. So this is a really good point. You can use italics for dialogue when you want to emphasize a word. So for example, okay, I suppose it's a little puffy. So the emphasis here is little because it's clearly not little. So it's a little bit of humor that I've implemented here. So you can use italics when something's not internal thought. You can use it on any word at all if you want, when you want to emphasize it, especially in dialogue. Good point there, Travis. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd now like you to have a go at, because I've been doing a lot of talking, is if you're comfortable, can you please post in the chat after giving this a go? If not, that's fine, keep it to yourself. Can you fill in at least one of the 3 dot point templates there with some dialogue? And then attach it with a verb, perhaps other than said. So you're coupling the verb to match what's being said. So for example, thank you everyone for joining today's workshop. Lisa went up and smiled. Thank you everyone, Lisa went up and smiled, for joining today's workshop. She said, laughing, thank you everyone for joining today's workshop. Something like that. Okay, 2 minutes, let's give it a go. And if you're brave, feel free to post. If not, that's completely fine. These are some good ones, guys. Lovely. That is really sad, Chloe. Okay, if you're still writing, that's perfectly okay. I'm just going to start talking now, though. Not a super amount of time for something as creative writing, but we have a lot of other things to get through. So just read a few things people have posted. Chloe has said, he whispered shakily, she didn't make it. Now that's really powerful because we have a sense of this character's emotions, where they're at, and then we have this dialogue to reinforce why. So it's almost like a little story within the sentence. We have a build up and then we have the climax, and it's like, oh wow, that's why this person is so sad. That's really powerful. Well done, Chloe. Trevor has said, I don't know if I can, Sarah replied, taking a deep breath. Maybe I can. So we go from one stream of argument and then shift into another. And that's actually a powerful thing as well. Well done. Travis has said, I suppose I was a bit worried, she answered, remembering her fears. It was frightening. There we go. Reinforcement of what she's thinking. Great. Which is it's broken up with that verb between the dialogue tags. And again, that's a really engaging way to grip your readers. Okay. Well done, everyone. All right. Now, before we have a break, I was hoping that we'd also do this short exercise too. Ideally, just to let you know, we wouldn't use these brain strain activities. We wouldn't treat them as 120 seconds or 2 minutes. You'd have like a good few, 5 to 10 minutes at least, because that's what creative writing is. It's a lot of time, effort, and energy. But for the sake of just exposing you to ways to do this, I've just given you sort of short activities. So here's a really good exercise for show, don't tell. It's one of my favies. It's where you write an emotion that your character feels, but you don't at any point label that emotion. So you don't even have all of this description of, why they're angry or that they're feeling anger. And then you go at the end, she's angry. You don't have that anywhere. It's just body language and internal thought and dialogue. That's it. We don't label the emotion. And then we need to guess and see if you've done a really good job in conveying that emotion to me and to your readers. So for example, as I said earlier, you don't write, Sarah was furious and anxious all at once. That's not quite as powerful as perhaps writing, Sarah balled her fists, clenched her teeth, her heart hammered in her throat, but her blood boiled beneath her skin. She had never felt quite like this before. So we have body language, and then we have reinforcement of that with thought. She had never felt like this before. So this is in third person, so that sort of counts as her, I suppose, nearly her internal dialogue. It's not formatted as such though. So if anyone would like to give this a go, this brain strain activity a go, can you write just even a few lines conveying, even building on the dialogue that you wrote before if you so wish, or not, your character, any character, emotion, but without labeling the emotion. So even if it's just one line explaining body language to do with anger or anxiety, I'll spit some more emotions at you to sort of get those synapses firing. Sadness, grief, mourning, romance, love, fixation, focus, determination, bravery, fear, anything like that. And these are usually really interesting ones because people will post all these different kinds of body language. So keen for this one. Excuse me. Okay, so, the comments are flooding in, lovely. Again, not a super amount of time for this activity to really do it justice, but I think you get the picture. I'm just going to read some that people have posted. So Trevor has posted, as she spoke, she tugged her hair and shifted nervously in her seat. This is going to be a real test, she thought. Good. So here I'm assuming that because Trevor has used the word nervously, that it's related to some kind of concern or anxiety or anticipation. I would say the fact that she's doing things like tugging her hair would not indicate incitement. It would be a more sort of negative kind of emotion because she's uncomfortable. So if I'm right, Trevor, feel free to go, yes, you are amazing. And if I'm wrong, then maybe don't post anything. But ideally, I think you've conveyed that really quite well. Okay, let's go to someone else. We'll go to Michelle. Rosalind lifted her face towards the sun, her eyes sparkling like the dew on the grass. Nice. A laugh escaped unbidden from between her smiling lips. Wonderful. So I'm feeling a sense of peace, maybe serenity, and a bit of joy here as well. So that's really lovely. And not once has Michelle listed those emotions. She's described them with body language and with scenery. That's beautiful. Travis has said, Erika stood there, tears flooded down her cheeks as she watched the screen flash by. Too many thoughts sprung through her mind as she watched the past slip by. Yeah, that's really powerful. I'd say maybe a bit of reminiscing in a negative way. It sounds like it, a bit of sadness, maybe even a bit of grief as well, depending on the memory. Again, this is the fun, right? We're figuring it out. We aren't quite sure. And as you were to read more in a scene that Travis would write, you would figure that out more and more. It's like little clues in a whole puzzle. It's pretty amazing. Julie has said, the heart racing, tunnel vision, jaw clenching, rush overwhelmed her again. Good. Okay. So again, the emotion isn't labeled. We're having to figure it out. Good. Sarah has said Lisa's body almost floated as she skipped along the sidewalk. She felt like her insides were suddenly illuminated, sending shafts of golden yellow out through the enormous smile spreading across her face. Good. A real sense of positive emotion here, but not specifically labeled as such. Yusuko, I hope I pronounced that correctly for you. Don't like when people mispronounce my name. Her teeth began chattering. Her eyes frantically searched the room. Good. Okay, we have some pretty specific language there. And guys, you're doing really well with this because we're going to cover imagery shortly after the break, and this is all a bit of imagery, so it's good to see that you sort of one up there as well. All right. And we'll go to Julianne and Chloe real quick. She stood back in the corner watching for the moment to speak up. Waiting. I'm assuming that's waiting for the moment to speak up. She just has to. A moment lost, never to return again. Good. Okay. So we have, again, this sense of sort of anticipation and just waiting. I hate that feeling of waiting sometimes. It's so like anxious driven. Good. And Chloe has said, Alex paused, his eyes wide. He started to breathe through his mouth. His breaths rapid as his shoulders shook. He blinked away tears. Again, negative emotion, not specifically labeled. You guys have done really, really well with this. And again, very closely related to imagery, which we'll cover shortly. So, now, I think what we'll do is we'll quickly go through this slide because a lot of it is stuff that you already seem to know. And then we'll have a short break where I'll answer some questions. You can go to Lou and so on. So just for this slide, when we bring it all together in regards to character chemistry in a gripping scene, you need to think about your dialogue showing that emotion, which we've already covered, but between two people. So again, it could be an argument, it could be a deep and meaningful conversation, it could be any kind of good or negative conversation, but the characters should, and this is what the second dot point says, bounce off of each other. So metaphorically speaking, of course, we talk about this idea of there should be this energy present. They should either relate or not relate to each other. That could lead to an argument, it could lead to a relationship, that kind of thing. So if it actually helps, and I know this sounds a little bit strange, but if you want to really step into your character's shoes and you're struggling to, a really good writing technique that some writers tend to do is sit down with a friend, say to them, okay, this is your character, this is my character, so they're both your characters, but that's who you're playing, this is who I'm going to play, my protagonist. Let's just have a conversation and talk back and forth with one another and really imagine, even if you need to close your eyes, and then sort of you can record it with your phone or something, come back to it later, cut out all of the small talk, all of that stuff you know you don't need to do, and then just see what it's like for two real people, even, you know, acting as other people. how they bounce off of each other, how that works. And if it doesn't work, you will be able to hear it in the recording and you go, oh, that's a bit cringeworthy, I don't like that. So you won't write it in your script or your again, your book or whatever it is you're writing for the scene. You won't do that. So it's actually really good to read things out loud or act them out, as funny as that sounds, because it gives life to it, which is what you're trying to do in your scene, is breathe life into the scene. When you also have this dialogue and you have character emotion, you need to think about how they affect one another. So not just what they're projecting, but how that's actually being responded to and reacted against. So for example, when we perform an action, there's always a reaction. So if I was to go up to someone and say, hey, I really like your dress, if they're a nice person, they might go, oh, thank you so much. If they're a bit uncomfortable or anxious, they might go, oh, and walk away. You know, so there's always a reaction. And your character's action and whoever's reacting is just as important for there to be chemistry. So that requires equal attention there. Another thing as well for character chemistry is that you are talking about, usually in this case, you know, real people. So you're trying to, I mean, for some of you, you could be doing a really abstract project where it's animals or objects talking or whatever. But in this case of people talking back and forth, remember that people always change. They can surprise each other, they can grow, their motivations can change, and that can happen halfway through a novel or towards the end. That is not uncommon. So don't be afraid to experiment with that and do it that way, which will in turn affect character chemistry. Because let's just say that Romeo and Juliet really, really want to be together, but then their motivations change. Maybe they're not in love with each other anymore, but they're married at this point and they're still committed. They choose to stay together and work things out. Therefore, your story is going to change and the way they interact is going to change. So that's all of these layers that you need to consider. When it comes to a romantic relationship, however, that is, you know, the lovey-dovey or the passion or the honeymoon phase or anything like that, there needs to be a push and pull, because that is what chemistry is in a story. And maybe, yeah, you might have in your life, if you're really blessed, a really great relationship with no problems, which is so good. Congratulations. But a lot of people don't have that. And in a story, really, if it's a protagonist, that shouldn't really be there, because again, storytelling is all about tension. It's all about a bit of drama. So there should be conflict there, and therefore character chemistry is going to be affected. So the push and pull is this idea of desire is pulling them together, but the conflict is keeping them apart. And maybe it'll ebb and flow like the ocean, and that's okay. But the internal factors could be pulling them apart, and then they keep going and pushing against it. So you experiment. It's that GMC coming into character chemistry. As mentioned just before, a romantic storyline can change. So the character might not be interested even though the circumstances are pulling them together. In the teenage world, you'll know this is calling, it's referred to as, I believe, the friend zone, and that's being written about in a lot of YA novels and so on. Anyway, I have no opinion on that. It's just that essentially it's something that you could write about. Okay. Oh, and all of these techniques can be used in a non-romantic relationship as well. Push and pull, actions and reactions, so on and so on. Okay, so that's all for me for now. Please take a break. We'll resume in about 10 minutes, so 11:10, and feel free to ask some more questions and I will answer them now. So.
Hi, Lisa. You've been doing great so far. This is why we keep inviting you back again to join us. So there were a couple of questions. Travis also he said he missed your explanation on foreshadowing and subtext. Could you possibly just quickly cover that again during the break?
Absolutely. So when it comes to foreshadowing and subtext, I'll explain what they are and how you can implement them. So foreshadowing is this idea that you hint that something is going to happen and then it later happens. So that's foreshadowing. Subtext and foreshadowing are quite related, because subtext means there's something happening below, so that you've got the main text storyline, and then you have like a subtext storyline, so subtext. So when you foreshadow something and it happens at the end, usually it's because of subtext. So, for example, let's just say, and this is a really sad example from a novel that I read within a few years ago, I'm pretty sure it was, I've got the timeline. There was mention of a character feeling uncomfortable about getting in a car. And we think it's just because she's anxious about everything, but it turns out later, at the very end of the novel, that she nearly died in a car crash. And that is why she's anxious, and she blames it on a bunch of other things. And from that one little comment, when you get to the end, you go, oh my goodness. And then it makes sense. But that was just a one little comment at the beginning that we forget about because all of this other stuff is happening. So that was subtext. It was a bit of text below the storyline because she was a secondary character. And then it foreshadowed the end. So you can drop that into dialogue, you can drop that into scenic descriptions, internal thought, wherever you want to plug that in, and then you don't have to visit that at all again until later when it happens, and boom, you've put together a puzzle. That's really quite clever. So foreshadowing and subtext are two what we call literary devices that you can put into your story to add more layers, essentially.
Excellent. Travis also asked earlier in the piece, do we have quotes around internal thoughts?
Great. Okay, that's a good question. I'm such a grammar nerd. So, grammar is punctuation and flow of language. When you have internal thoughts, the reason why we use italics is because you don't need to use quotation marks. Quotation marks are only when something is being said out loud. Italics is where it's just thought in the head.
Excellent. And I'll just read you out. Hayden had posted his answer to the last exercise in the Q&A box, so you probably can't see that one on your screen, Lisa. So he says, Sarah looked around anxiously, her heart pounding as she placed the makeup into her jacket pocket. She gulped as a firm hand grasped her shoulder.
She stole something and got caught. Hayden never ceases to impress me. And welcome back, Hayden. I don't think I saw your name before, but lovely to see you again. See you again. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good one, actually. Quite gripping in the sense of, oh, she's stealing something. And then I got really hooked really quickly because I thought, oh, that's a bit cheeky. And then she got caught and you go, oh, man. Heads up for some of you who do enjoy young adult fiction. One of the most interesting beginning parts, so that, that first few pages, that'll make or break if a literary agent or a publishing house actually picks up your work and keeps reading or chucks it away. One of the most interesting first sections of any YA novel that I've read was actually Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, which is a really, really popular series now. She opens up, this is not a spoiler alert, so I can tell you this, but within the first few pages, the character's actually stealing things and you think, wow, that's really bad. And then you discover pretty quickly that she's got a really good reason for doing it. And you think, actually, I can kind of empathize with this. So I think that's really interesting, just the concept that you're playing with then, Hayden. Cool.
Great. And Travis says, in one book, I have a lot of thought dialogue of quotes to point this out as dialogue.
Okay, so breaking down what you said there, Travis, in a book, I have a lot of thought dialogue. So are you talking, I might be interpreting this the wrong way, so I'll just ask another question. When you say thought dialogue, do you mean like sort of telepathic thoughts responding to each other? So like if I didn't talk out loud and Tracy didn't talk out loud and we just thought to one another and had a dialogue, is that what you're talking about there? Or telepathic? Yes, awesome. Okay, so technically punctuation-wise, it's not grammatically correct, but you actually have creative licensing to do that if you want in your novel. It's not common, and if you have an editor, they'll probably ask you to do it the conventional way, but really it's your book, isn't it? So it's really up to you. And I actually show everyone something later where we break the punctuation rules for the sake of streamlining a thought process. So there's no punctuation, it's just constant stream of words. You're allowed to do things like that. But if you're asking me as an English teacher and a writer and a previous editor, punctuation wise, I would actually just I just do it in italics with no quotation marks, and then somehow I would plug in, for example, I put a comma and then who thought it, and then I put who thinks it, comma, think it, and then you treat it essentially the same way as you would with dialogue, but without the quotation marks. You just use italics. So you use those verbs to explain what's being thought and how it's being thought. That's one way that you could do it. Another way, of course, is just implying it. So when you write a novel, remember that, I don't have a novel next to me, but remember that the first line of every paragraph is indented. So if you had like one person on one line saying something and then go to another line, go to another line, go to another line, it's sort of implied that they're talking back and forth. I need to show the dialogue, but not let the other characters know what is happening. Oh yeah, so you can still do that with italics. So if they're just thinking in their head, no one else can hear them. And if you specifically use the word she thought angrily or something like that, or she thought in a hushed internal voice or something creative like that, it's still only internal thought. So that's what I'd recommend. But I mean, by all means, Travis, it's your novel. And if that's how you want to project it, as using italics and quotation marks, there is no one who should tell you that you can't do that, because it's something obviously really creative. Telepathy, which I'm a huge fan of. I love fantasy and sci-fi stuff like that, so kudos to you. But really it's up to you. But conventional punctuation would suggest that you don't use quotation marks, you just use the italics. 3 books later, I'll stick to this. Yeah, sounds good.
We don't have any other questions at the moment, Lisa, so I'll just switch back to your time for a break screen and we'll see what comes in.
Excellent. Thanks, Tracy. I will just say as well that as I was scrolling through the chat, I missed a really golden thing that someone had said, and I'm just trying to find it again. When we were talking about writing politely, let's see. Yeah, Travis said, I've killed off too many people to be polite. It was so good. I kind of read it as I was presenting and went, don't laugh, now's not the time. That's really good. I've killed off too many people to be polite. See, I never ever wanted to do those kind of things. I was like, I want to kill off this character, I want to piss off my audience. But I mean, do it. Just do it. If it's for a good purpose, you should just always do those things. You should always just go that extra mile. Plus, even if it annoys your audience, they're talking about it, aren't they? They're talking about your book. And by all means, yes, convey as many good moral messages as you can, because you are, whether or not you like it as a writer, if you have a published book, you are an authoritative figure, you are an influential figure, and anyone who picks up your book could very well go and do the things that you're proposing your characters do or don't do. So you are, in a sense, automatically a role model, even if you wish to remain mostly anonymous behind your book. So you actually have a lot of power when you publish a book, which is why I think authors cop a lot of flack when they promote something that's not good in a book. But again, there's critics everywhere and they might misinterpret something that you've said. Oh, Sarah has said, what about using swear words in adult fiction to emphasize an emotion in dialogue? Absolutely. That's done all the time. In fact, it's not just done in adult books now, it's done in young adult fiction too. For those of you who don't know, young adult fiction is usually between the ages of 12 to 18, but you'll find that because of the style of writing, because it's so gripping and so character-based over just description, so imagery, a lot of adults read it too because it's just so easy to read. And you'll find that because young adult deals with a lot of adult topics, there is a lot of swearing sometimes. So yeah, absolutely. When you're trying to emphasize an emotion, saying those naughty words is actually really powerful, because we'll read the whole way through the book and think, this book doesn't have any swearing. And then you'll swear to emphasize a point and you go, whoa, okay, where did that come from? And that stops and makes you reread it again. I remember I got 3 books in to a book series, a young adult book series. There was no swearing, none of that kind of content. And then a character had a fight with another character and swore for the first time in 3 books. And I went, wow, what the heck? It just comes out of nowhere and it grips you. So swear words, as much as they're, like not a great thing to encourage if a teenager is reading it, the reality is that teenagers swear anyway. They don't like it when you spoon feed them not to do that sort of thing. So they're going to do it anyway. And if you're putting it in there to emphasize a point that's more powerful than, the don't swear sort of thing, that actually really works. So yeah, no, I would agree with that. But I don't like swearing, so I would not want to swear personally, but I have thought about putting it in my book just simply for the sake of emphasizing a scene. And morally, I battle with myself because I think, I wouldn't swear even if my readers would. Should I do it? So it's really just up to you. That's a good question, Sarah. Cool.
Lisa, Donna says, hi Lisa, I'm writing a memoir. I'm assuming all this applies to this genre as well. Are there any particular tips you could give?
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Donna. So with memoir pieces, I actually went through this at the very beginning of the year with my students, so my year 11s. And what I said to them is this: a memoir is a story. So all of this conventional stuff applies because you're still telling a story. It's still about characters. It's still about emotion. It's still about imagery. It's still about dialogue. But memoir has very specific genre sort of conventions attached to that as well. So with a memoir piece, it should be, so memoir and autobiography are two different things. And memoir is about a very specific part of someone's life, and an autobiography is the whole way through. So with an autobiography and biography. With a memoir piece, it's about a specific section, maybe even just a span of a few years rather than the whole life. So that's one convention, is that it's a segment rather than the whole thing. The second thing as well is that it's usually in past tense, but I mean, don't pay too much attention to that. It's however you want to present it. Another convention as well is that it's all focused on emotional response to whatever's being thrown to the person experiencing it. So emotion is really high in a memoir piece because it's so character driven, because it's about that character's experiences and how they interact with the world around them. So yes, I would absolutely agree that all the things we're going through today can definitely apply to a memoir piece. Awesome. Okay. I think any more questions we'll leave until the end. And right now we'll power on through and we'll move into the next section. So thanks for your questions, everyone. And thank you for narrating them, Tracy. Okay, so we have now mastered, can you really ever master anything? We've mastered this idea of creating believable and engaging characters with dialogue. So now what do we do with that? The next thing that we need to do, which I can see already that a lot of you can do quite well, is hooking readers in not just through the heart of a scene, so, you know, by creating these compelling characters in a riveting scene, but by making a scene more riveting by appealing to the senses of your readers. So I call this the breadth of the scene. So the heart of the scene is your character, and the breadth of the scene, the thing that makes you sort of wake up and feel refreshed or just hooked in general, even furthermore so, is appealing to the senses. And we can do that using imagery. So what is imagery? Well, according to thine internet, the interwebs, the definition for imagery, it's a noun, so it's a thing, is writing that is descriptive using literary or figurative language. So things like metaphors, similes, alliteration, all the stuff that you can research later if you're not sure what it is, so don't feel overwhelmed. And it's often used to make your readers feel something, to elicit emotion. So an example in poetry, and I'm going to try to not geek out too much, is Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. So this is only one excerpt of it, so one little section, and I really admire Wilfred Owen. He's a World War I poet, and he wrote about his time in the trenches and in war, and it's just so gripping. So let's just read through it really quickly here. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you two could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old et decorum est pro patria mori. So if you don't know what dulce et decorum est pro patria mori means, it's Latin for it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. And what Wilfred Owen here is he's really strongly conveying a message that war is not all it's cracked up to be, and that's just his opinion. So here we can see that the way he's delivering this message is very powerful. It's so gripping. Just all of his descriptions, the things that make us feel uncomfortable about this, we imagine some really uncomfortable imagery because he's doing a really good job of describing it. And that's what you need to do. You need to have a purpose why you're writing things the way that you are. So for example, here, he wants to make people uncomfortable with the concept of war. So he tells it the way he sees it, which is really uncomfortable and disturbing. So he's trying to disturb his readers. If you're writing a love scene, you're probably trying to make your readers swoon or feel empathy. So your language would be very different. You wouldn't use words with sort of disgusting connotations attached to it or meanings. So for example, gargling, oh, couldn't speak properly, gargling from the froth corrupted lungs. That's a really uncomfortable image to imagine. Whereas if it was come gargling from the lungs, that's a little bit less graphic. So again, the more you add on, the more we imagine. Here's another reason why it's so gripping. If you didn't know this already, I've color coded this for you here. Look at all of the different literary devices that he uses in just this one section. He's a genius. The man's a genius. Excellent writer. He's used alliteration, allusion, assonance, consonants. You can Google these later if you want. Direct address, simile, and of course, imagery. Technically, the whole thing is imagery, but I've just used the green to highlight the most powerful bits of imagery that he really uses. Otherwise, the whole thing would be green and you wouldn't see the other color coding. So we have choking, guttering, drowning. That's pretty descriptive. The ing at the end is also repetition, so that's reinforcing a point. Writhing in his face, so the white eyes writhing in his face, so not just they're just there in his face, they're writhing, so they're moving around in a really uncomfortable manner. Gargling instead of just the water sitting there, sorry, the blood sitting there. From the froth corrupted lungs, we already talked about that, etc., etc. So this is really powerful imagery, and this is in a poem. And in a book, you have a lot more opportunity than in a poem to just insert imagery wherever you can. So again, really good example here. So it's all well and good to go, yes, well, this is a great way and a great place for you to incorporate imagery, copy this, but we don't work that way. Personally, I don't work that way. I need some kind of writing prompt. I need to be able to think of how I can put that into my story. So here are the best activities that I use work for my students, have worked for all the attendees I've tried before. So you've probably, if you're revisiting and having another webinar session with me today, you may have done this before, but they're really fun and I've changed them up a little bit. So hopefully you won't mind repeating them. Okay, so we're going to try the phone a friend exercise. So it's this concept where I pretend I'm on the phone to a friend, but this friend is super old-fashioned. They don't have a computer. I have no way to send them this image that I actually really want them to see. So say, for example, I took a picture on a holiday and it looks amazing and I want to show it to my friend, but I have no way to send it to them. I'd really have to print it and just mail it to them, and that will take too long. And we're on the phone and I can't send it to them electronically, so I'm just going to describe it. Now, the issue here is that they cannot see what I can see. Your reader cannot see what you can imagine. So you need to recreate the image using only descriptive language. So here are your instructions. I'm going to show you an image in the slides yet to come, and then I'm going to take it away. So you need to try and burn that image into your brain. Remember as much as you can, and then just describe what you can remember. And it's okay if you miss some stuff, that's fine. The purpose of the exercise is to really cling on to your imagination, make it your own, and recreate it using language only. So let's give it a go. Here's your image. So maybe just note down some dot points is what I'm trying to say. Note down some dot points about all of the different things, the elements to do with this image. So think, for example, about texture, people, placement, color symbolism perhaps. Think about scenery. Think about body language. Think about anything that helps you bring this image to life. So I'll leave this up for a little bit longer and then I'll take it away. And then try to turn your dot points into even just like a line, just one line will do, about something that you can note about this to sort of recreate the image. And then if you're comfortable, feel free to post it in the chat. Think about lighting as well. That's a really powerful thing to include in your scenes. I don't know about you, but when I read a scene and I think of soft lighting, I think of softer emotion. Harsher lighting, maybe something bad is happening in the scene. That's the power of film as well. Lighting will consistently change, can symbolize different things. There's a lot of different textual elements that we need to consider when we recreate something. Okay. I know it's not a super long amount of time, but I'm going to take the image away now and just try and recreate what you can from what you can imagine. So the image is gone now. I've gone back to the previous slide. See if you can post what you can remember after turning it into just one sentence will do, just a quick activity, and then feel free to share it in the chat. We won't go through too many and too much depth just for the sake of time, but it's a good exercise for you to sort of wrap your head around. Okay, Travis has posted something in the chat. Let's have a look at that. First in, first serve. The couple walked side by side along the rain-soaked path that twisted through the tall and slender trees. Oh, lovely. The lights cast their glare in the water as they strode along. Beautiful. What you've done here, Travis, is you've captured some of the body language, the figures, the characters in the scene, the scenic sort of element of it as well, and the weather, which are some very important things that ground your reader and help them imagine things immediately. And you've done it in one sentence, which is really good. Well done. Cool. So, because we have a lot of other things to get through, we'll power through this one. If you have finished writing or you're finishing up writing what you're writing, feel free to still post it. That's absolutely fine. Let other people appreciate your writing and me when I can read it later. But we'll go back to the slide. So here you can see that Travis has captured this really well. If he had more time, I'm assuming that Travis clearly knows what he's doing with writing, would also talk about all of the different colours. He'd talk more about the lighting, more about things that are sort of positioned in there. Or Michelle's posted something. In early evening, a winding wet path, all good, winding wet, so we have alliteration, wet, disappears into the distance. The autumn colours of the trees lining the edges are warmed. That's a powerful word, isn't it? Warmed. We think of like an emotional sort of response to that too. Warmed by the glow of luminous street lights. A couple clings, alliteration, good job, to each other beneath an umbrella, most likely on a romantic stroll as they walk away from a lonely bench. A lonely bench. Well done. Good job, guys. Good, good, good. Okay, so what's the time now? We'll power through. If there was another one if we had time to do, I would suggest doing something like this because it's very different in nature to the painting that we've just looked at. We see eeriness, we see complete different color changes. It's a bit more harsh in some ways, completely different genre, if you will. This one could be romance, could be something else, but this one is definitely some kind of horror or thriller or suspense or something that's kind of uncomfortable in nature. So your language, your lexical choice, which just means word choice, would change so that you could describe this differently. Good job, guys. Okay, another activity that we could use to elicit imagery is the magical experience cube. I try to plug this in every webinar, every workshop that I present, simply because it is really, really useful. So in the past, when I've done this previously, had some really good responses. This is just an example of one. So you imagine that whenever your character is encountering a scene of importance, so whatever's happening in that scene, person, place, internal, external conflict, whatever, we think about appealing to the senses of your readers if you want to hook them in. So this is to create imagery, to create that image in their head. What can the character see? What can they hear? What can they feel, touch, etc.? So feel sort of being their emotional side and touch being sort of physical. So like I can touch this bottle and I feel a strong connection to it, So that's a little bit different. And then what can they smell and taste? And they're together because they're often interrelated. You ever smell something and it's so strong you can taste it? That kind of thing. So that's the experience cube. This is what it looks like when it's filled in. Note that, so this is, for example, if your character was lost and trapped in a storm. Note here that with see, hear, touch, smell, taste, there are a lot of sensory rich words. So all that means is that it's not just leaves are flying, it's maybe they're flying frantically or something. We have, for example, palm trees swaying and twisting. So in this particular instance, it's really provoking that imagination to think of things because you're using strong verbs and adjectives. So verbs are doing words and adjectives are describing words, just in case you need the recap. I do sometimes. So see, hear, touch, smell, taste. We have a lot of different things here. When we think of what can your reader hear, think about words that actually make us think of the sound. So for example, doors shaking, windows rattling. I don't know about you, but I can imagine from previous storms that I've been in, memories of windows rattling. So when you use a word like that, a sensory driven word, it will make your reader think of whatever is applicable to their experience. So that's a powerful thing. That's why sometimes when we go on a holiday, we get a particular kind of perfume or cologne. We spray that, we wear that during the whole holiday. And years later, if you smell that cologne on someone, you go, oh my gosh, that's when I went to Europe or whatever, because it reminds us. So if you use words like this, imagery related sounds, immediately cognitively we go, oh, I can actually imagine that because I was there. So that's a pretty powerful thing too. Okay, so usually I'd give you more than a few minutes here. I've got 5, but there's other things I want to get through and some questions I still want to answer. So let's just power through this one. It's a good one to sit down and do later too. By all means, spend a lot of time doing this. But this is the experience cube that you can fill in. So this one's a little bit more to do with the direct scene that's probably more applicable to any kind of genre, and it's a fight. So it doesn't mean physical, it could mean verbal, just conflict. So imagine in this instance that you have a character and they're involved in the middle of a fight. So we're coming in halfway through. There's no build up, nothing like that. We're halfway in the fight. It can be verbal, can be physical, completely up to you. But we need to know what they can see, hear, feel and touch, taste and smell. So even just some dot points for this, not even sentences, will be enough to sort of provoke that imagination. So feel free to just post them as they come to your head into the chat. Think of a fight. What's the first thing that comes to your head that you can see, hear, feel, touch, taste, smell? We'll just spend a few minutes doing this, and then I have some other goodies for you as well. Oh, Chloe's leaving early. Thank you very much, Chloe. Hope you have a lovely weekend, and thank you for joining us this morning. Thanks very much. It's so nice when people thank you. What a lovely thing. My students just come up to me sometimes and go, oh, thank you, Miss Van Alpen. That was such a good lesson. I go, yes, thank you so much in my head. And out loud I go, you're very welcome. It's a good thing. This will be interesting to see what people come up with. What's your interpretation of a fight? Is it fisticuffs? Is it verbal abuse? Is it more low-key than that? Very interesting. Sarah has said, he watched as the enormous fist blundered towards his face. Ooh, that makes me a little bit afraid. That's a good description because I just immediately in my head, I have this image of, I'm not actually going to punch my camera so don't freak out, but just, straight into the face. So just, it takes up your whole vision. And to me, I'm a little lady, like I'm not very tall. I'm about 5 foot, I think, when one of my colleagues measured me. I'm pretty short. I get mistaken for a student. If something that big came towards me, my experience is that I go, ooh, don't freak out. So to me, Personally, I think that's a really good way to describe something because it's using hyperbole. Because obviously the fist isn't actually enormous. Enormous is like this massive thing, whereas the fist is probably max maybe this big. But using hyperbole, which is extreme exaggeration, literary device, FYI, really emphasizes how overwhelming this must be for whoever is experiencing this punch to the face. So good job, Sarah. So that's what we can see. Has anyone written anything for hear or feel or touch or taste or smell or anything like that? Danielle has said she could hear the others breathing, growing deeper, measured and menacing. Ooh, it's a bit creepy, isn't it? Well done. And I like here as well, Danielle, that you've put measured and menacing. So and. So again, that's alliteration. Excellent stuff. Good. Okay. As usual, guys, feel free to keep posting in the chat. That's completely up to you. Oh, Donna's has come through, so I'll just quickly make time for Donna. Donna has said, the fist hit his face with the same dense thud of the mallet against the steak last night. Oh, so we've used a simile, so comparing something to something else to give us more of a visual. Good stuff. Oh, all these comments have come in. Oh, it's amazing. Good, Donna, that's good because it makes me think of the idea of feeling, but also sound, because you've used the word thud. So again, that's quite a sensory noise as well. Well done. Sensory word, I should say. Julie has said his ragged breathing and hurt glare was like a whipped cur. She knew she had hurt him to the quick. Well done. Trevor has said he wrapped his left arm around the visitor's neck and began to punch with a hateful power. As each punch landed with a sickening thud, the visitor tasted the sweetness of blood as his split lip dripped blood on his white shirt. Good. A lot of descriptive language there, very visual. Well done, guys. Good stuff. Okay. Now we're up to, after looking at all of this imagery, which is really powerful, so we've looked at the heart of the scene, we've looked at the breadth of the scene, and usually I'd want to spend a lot longer doing that as well, but c'est la vie, we're moving on to the bones of the scene. So this is where usually you could start off like this. Some people choose to do structure first. Other people are a little bit more lackadaisical in their approach occasionally, and they'll just go back and just edit the structure in, which is usually what most people do. Not just to be sort of like, I suppose, spontaneous about their planning, but mostly because you want to get stuff down and then go back and polish it. So let me show you what this looks like. Now, this is a beautiful, beautiful paragraph by Provost, Gary Provost. I'm not super familiar with his work, but I always come back to this paragraph that he wrote. It's a really powerful one about structure and what impact that actually has on your readers. So let's spend a little bit of time just looking at this one. So I'll read it for you, but feel free to turn your volume down and read it in your head if you'd prefer. It's one of those paragraphs where it needs to hit you in a way that you like listening or reading to it most, because otherwise it loses its power. So feel free to turn the volume down right now and just read it, or you can listen to me. That's fine too. I do sound a little bit nasally today. I do apologize. I've got allergies and so on, but I'll do my best to read this for you eloquently. So here we go. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this. It is important. That's a pretty powerful paragraph. I know it sounds pretty straightforward, sounds kind of boring too, but the way that you structure your paragraphs are actually super important. That's why we have the indented lines. The first line is indented, so pushed in, that means, between paragraphs when you read a book. Because let's be real, we lose interest pretty quickly in things. I know if I were to send a really thick email to my students or to you, and it was just info dumping, which is just a big fat paragraph, who really wants to read that? And we tune out because we can only hold on to certain amounts of information from different parts. So if you chunk out your paragraphs, if you break up your sentences, it actually holds its power. And that means that each time you deliver a little message in each of the lines, which is what writing is, it's delivering a message, whether or not it's to imagine something or to invoke an emotion or anything like that, it keeps its power because it's contained to different kinds of sentences. So it's pleasing to the eye, it's easier to hold on to, easy to imagine, and it's just gripping. That's why it's gripping. So what Provost has done here is he's provided almost a template. And I kid you not, I will copy and paste this paragraph in almost every chapter that I do, and I will just mimic the sentence structure because it's powerful. So there's nothing wrong with you doing that. So if you want to find this again, just type in Gary Provost's paragraph template or writing on paragraphs, and you'll find this. It's a really classic one that a lot of writers go to, and it's really helped me really sort of break up my sentence structure. And it's sort of gotten to the point where I don't really need to look at it anymore. I can just sort of, I hear it in my head when I read it out loud, which you should be doing with a lot of your writing, because we lose stuff when we just imagine it. When it's sort of spoken out loud, we can filter through it more and edit more. But it's got to the point now where I kind of just don't really need it anymore. I have an ear for it, and you do attune yourself to it. It is kind of a musical thing. It's rhythm. Your sentence structure is rhythm, and it's art. So it's supposed to make you feel something. So if it doesn't make you feel engaged, it's probably worth editing. If for nothing else, thank you for this. You're welcome. God bless you, Travis. Good stuff. It's really, really good. So personally, it's just awesome. So it's not as boring as what I said it was going to be. So it's good. All right, let's go to the next part. So scene pacing and lexical choice, which is just word choice to reflect action in a scene. So I didn't want to say anything before because I didn't want to get into it too early. But when we were doing those activities earlier about explaining emotion, about dialogue, about imagery, there was something very valuable that we actually missed out, and that was scene pacing. So, and none of you really did this, which is a really good thing indeed. So I'm not in any way picking on anyone. It's just to let you know that if you were to write a scene, your sentence structure and pacing needs to reflect what's happening in that scene. So for example, some writers actually make a really common mistake, and it still works. We can still read it and it's still fine, but it's actually not as powerful as what it could be when, for example, writers create a fight scene, for example, and pretty much none of you did this, but if you want to have really long-winded sentences about they did this and she did that and he did this and she did that, it's actually a really long sentence to read. And if you think about the action that's in a fight, if it's a physical fight, it's not long-winded things. It's short, sharp, and quite literally punchy a lot of the time. So your sentence structure should be short, sharp, and punchy, because the sound it creates when you break things up sounds very similar to the fighting in a scene, if that makes sense. So I have some examples for this pacing in the slides yet to come between, for example, a fight scene and a romance scene. And you'll see that the sentence structure is very different. The pacing is very different. So this is often one of the most common things that gets overlooked in writing, is actually sentence structure and pace, because it's the least interesting thing. We want to deliver a message. We don't really care about how it's delivered sometimes. And we often rely on our editors to do this for us if you are lucky enough to get published. Don't do that. If you want to impress someone, if you're trying to hook a literary agent or an editor, come in with this scene pacing, lexical choice and structure already done, because then they'll go, oh, this person really knows what they're doing. They know a lot of layers to this craft. So really make sure that you try to wrap your head around this, because it will serve you so, so well. Whether or not you're writing, I don't know, a screenplay, usually this kind of thing is best for a novel, but it also works in poems as well, and occasionally song lyrics too. Anyway, so when you're also writing this and you're structuring and you're pacing it, are you choosing the right words? Now, unfortunately, the way that I used to write things is that I've always been quite poetic, and I love flourishing my language. So I love going, oh, you know, this is like this and that is like that. And I love scenery descriptions as well. I just love nature, a bit of a, I don't know, not a hippie, but I love nature. I love going for walks. I love appreciating just everything that was, you know, created. It's a beautiful thing. So I love writing about that in my books. However, there's a time and a place for it. And I never really used to think about this, and it's only within the past few years that I have been. But when you do things like a fight scene, scenery is not important. The most important thing is the fighting that's happening, what's immediate in there. Because we have tunnel vision when we have a fight, don't we? So should your book. It should only be looking at the particular thing in mind. Whereas if you're doing a romantic sort of scene, scenery probably is important, because it could reflect the emotion that's in your scene. So for example, if you're laying on a beach in your lover's arms and it's really romantic and the sun is setting, that kind of sets the scene, doesn't it? Because it's a romantic ambience. Whereas we couldn't give, you know, we couldn't care less, essentially, if there was a sunset happening while there was a fight, unless it's to project a particular point. So again, your lexical choice, your word choice matters, and it will either derail the focus of your reader from the scene, or it will sort of suck them in. So again, time and place is what I've learned with lexical choice and scene pacing. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example now of this kind of pacing and sentence structure. I came up with this really, really quickly, so it's not quite as reflective of what I usually write, and it's also very different because I usually don't write things like this, but this is just to show you a point. And then I have an example from another book on the next slide. I couldn't find any fight scenes to sort of paste and reference underneath, so I just wrote this for you. So here we go. I slugged Mika in the jaw. He staggered backwards, staring at me, wordless. Then he launched forward and grabbed the collar of my shirt and yanked. He brought his arm back swiftly, but I was faster. I punched him 2, 3, 4, 5 times, left, right, left, right. I saw red, saw the scarlet streaked across his face, the crimson dribbling from his split lip, and still, this was not enough. It would never be enough. I hit him again. I hit him until my fist screamed at me and my pulse thundered in my ears, and I didn't give a damn that I could just not stop. I could not stop. I could not stop. Fingers snatched my shoulders and dragged. I clawed at the air, resisting. So you'll notice a few things about this, and one of them is that I've broken a rule, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the other thing, of course, is this thing I've just talked about in regards to scene pacing. So you'll notice that, again, the sentence structure is really short, sharp, and quick, because the action that is happening in this scene is short, sharp, and quick. So my sentence structure needs to reflect that. So whether or not you think that I've written this well in the short amount of time that I had to write this is irrelevant. We're looking at the scene pacing and structure. Note as well that, again, I'm doing that sentence variation that Provost prompts in his paragraph. So if we go all the way back to here, he does short ones, medium sentences, long ones. And as we get to this one here, you'll notice that it goes short, 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 longer, longer as we become more and more gripped. And then it gets to a point now where I'm not just talking about the character's actions, I'm talking about their thoughts. So here I break it up between what he's doing and what he's thinking. So here I go, saw the scarlet streaked across his face, the crimson dribbling from his split lip. That's all action, that's all description, and then I add some thought. This is not internal dialogue, by the way, so it's not in italics, it's just observing what your character must be feeling and thinking. It's a bit confusing, but they're slightly different. And still, this was not enough. It would never be enough. I hit him again. So again, we're back to action. We're not thinking anymore. It's action. I hit him until my fist screamed, action, and my pulse thundered in my ears, action, and I didn't give a damn. So now we're talking about thought, that I could just not stop. I could not stop. I could not stop. And it gets interrupted with an N dash. An N dash, by the way, is two hyphens put next to each other. It looks a little bit like that. I'll put it in the chat. Whereas hyphens are like that. So I've put a space between them. So an N dash will happen automatically in software like Microsoft Word. You just put them right next to each other and then you send it, essentially. Or you press enter, depends on what kind of platform you're in. And this is used to indicate an interruption in thought, action, or dialogue. So you just cut it off wherever it's being interrupted. So if it was cut off at the S, I didn't even get to say stop for stop. If it was just S, then you just cut it off at the S. That's up to you. It's a really useful grammatical tool, and it actually shows then and there in your writing that something has been cut off really dramatically. And then your reader goes, oh, and they feel that interruption the same way that your character does. It's actually a really frustrating thing as a reader, and it works so well. So do not be afraid to use this. It's really good. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out here, was this interruption of thought. But it's the thought itself that I want to point out to you the most, because it is actually, I'm breaking a rule here. What you can probably notice is that there is not punctuation in this line after the point of I didn't give a damn. Because then I go, I could not stop, I could not stop, I could not stop. And there should be commas or full stops here, but we don't put that in. We don't put that in because it's a streamline of thought that just goes and goes and goes. There's no pause, so we don't have punctuation. And that is your right as a writer. It's your creative licensing property for you to put that in if it reflects a point. So you're using style to make a statement, essentially. And my statement here is that my character is so far gone in their anger that there is no pause. It's just constant stream of thought. In fact, I know plenty of books. I'm just going to post this in the chat for you, that will do something like that instead of spaces. So in the chat, if you can't read that, or even if you are, I've put what I've written here. I could not stop, I could not stop, I could not stop. To simply, I can't stop, I can't stop, I can't stop. And there's no spaces. There's no room for breath. It's just so overwhelmingly crammed together that it's almost like an anxious streamline of spiraling thought. And there are quite a few novels that actually do this. No grammatical symbols, no spaces, nothing like that. And then they'll just end the line like that because it reflects what the character's feeling. So you can break some punctuation rules if it's for this sake, but usually you always want to be grammatically correct. So that's something I wanted to show to you as well. And the reason why I've done this here, just to explain it a bit more in detail, is that this lack of punctuation shows the rapid succession, the impulsivity, the negativity, just the anxiety that my character's feeling, but then also that rage, you know, nothing else seems to matter. And then of course, in the middle of this fight, they're interrupted because we then find out in the next line that they're snatched away from the fight, that they're having a brawl in, and then they're really resisting this. So that's something to keep in mind with fight scenes. But what about something very different, like a romance scene? I won't read this whole thing to you. It's very passionate. This is a scene excerpt from a young adult series called The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare. She's a really good writer, in my opinion. Sorry, that was a bit biased. I think she's a really good writer. And I really enjoyed her books as a teenager. And to this day, I still think that she's a pretty good writer for various reasons. And here she has very different sentence structure, depending on what she's trying to deliver. So when it's a scene of excitement, you'll see in this excerpt here that she uses short to medium sentence structure because it's, you know, rapid succession. It is this, you know, heartbeat is increasing. We're getting a bit excited. Oh, what's going to happen? And then as it becomes more and more of a streamline of thought that can't be stopped, when these two people realize in this scene that they really want to kiss, it just goes and goes and goes. So it's reflective of their thought process. So I'll just read the middle paragraph for you, and that should be enough to prove the point here. So here we go. "If you want me to stop, tell me now," he whispered. And when she said nothing, he brushed his lips against the hollow of her temple. "Or now?" His mouth found her cheek, the line of her jaw. He tasted her skin, sweet, salty dust and desire. "Or now?" His mouth traced the line of her jaw, and she arced up into him, making her fingers dig into the ground. Her small, panting breaths were driving him crazy, and he put his mouth over hers to quiet her, whispering, telling, not asking, now. So again, it follows a structure, doesn't it? Sort of like Freytag's pyramid. We have a build-up, and then we have, boom, the kiss scene. And then later afterwards, you might have sort of the falling action and then the resolution to that. But we don't need this for this scene because it's so exciting and it's not the end of the story, of course. So we don't put that in this scene. But as you can see, the sentence structure here is very different. The sentence structure before, whoops, here we go. The sentence structure before was mostly really short and then had a long bit at the end. And then this one is a mixture of everything depending on the emotion, because there's more than just rage in this scene. There's not rage. There is more than just one emotion, whereas in the previous scene, it was just rage. Whereas in this one, it's excitement, it's a bit of love, there's some passion, there's a little bit of anxiety depending on how you perceive it. So there's a lot of things we're working with, and therefore the sentence structure reflects that. Hopefully that makes sense. Very good series though, I really enjoyed it. So this was the webinar structure that we went through today. So you've learned a lot of stuff in a comparatively short amount of time on a Saturday morning after what has probably been a busy week for all of us to some degree. So really well done. Now we can recap. So we take a deep breath after being info dumped with all of this stuff. So to summarize, where there are two or more characters, there should be clear character chemistry present in your scene. And this is where your characters will bounce off of one another. And whether or not that is positive or negative chemistry, that's completely up to you. But it needs to feel natural and it needs to feel believable. Always avoid 2D protagonists. Always try to create believable characters that are layered with GMC, so goal, motivation, and conflict. Vary your dialogue presentation, break it up between actions, use different verbs, rely on said because it's a skim word, it's a filler word that we can just breeze past, but don't use it too much, just like you wouldn't use verbs to describe the dialogue other than said too much. It's a fine balance, which you will become more attuned to over time if you're not already. It's just common practice and repetition. Appeal to your reader's senses using imagery. Never underestimate the power of imagery. It's really gripping. And also, to be honest, it's actually just really impressive. So if we read a scene that a writer has written and it just sounds really good, we go, oh my gosh, I really trust this writer. They're such a good writer. So by all means, flourish your creative accomplishments in that writing scene. Just don't go too far because you are telling a story, not just showing off, essentially. So structure your paragraphs as well in manners that reflect the pace and the emotion in your scene as well. That's really powerful. And then overall, combining it all together sounds a little bit like this. Writing gripping scenes requires a fine combination of character insight and layers, emotion, engaging dialogue, imagery, and structure. Look at that. You're doing several different things in one scene. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very complicated balance, and to do it well is a really good skill and craft. So you've learned a fair bit today, and I could already see with a lot of your writing, a lot of you knew some of these things. So hopefully this has been valuable to you in different ways. And yeah, very, very well done, everyone. It's been a pleasure to present to you today. So now I'm happy to take any more questions. If you would like to contact me in future, you can contact me on lisa.von.alpen@gmail.com. Please keep in mind, and I was speaking to Tracy earlier about this today, I'm having a bit of trouble with my Gmail for some reason. So are some of the people that I know. I don't know what it is. It might be an update thing. So if I don't reply super quick, I'm either busy with marking or it's my Gmail. But I'll get back to you ASAP. So if you'd like to connect in future, please feel free to email me there. Connect with me on Instagram. That's probably where I'm the most prevalent. And I really, really love reading things that you post if you post writing. So yeah, feel free to contact me in future. Don't be a stranger. Got to stick together in the writing community, especially in little old Adelaide. So good stuff. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just going to switch your beautiful face to the front so we can chat to you now. There we go. So Lynette would like to know about endings. If some romantic tension develops between two characters, is it okay to leave the reader wondering whether they end up together? A mystery genre, not a romance.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to move my chair. There we go. Absolutely. That is actually a really good question. So when we think about, what's a good example? So I keep saying young adult because that's the genre that I write the most of. When I think of young adult, so that's where I'm most comfortable in that sphere of writing, usually readers always want an answer, don't they? They always want, oh, well, are they together or aren't they? And whether or not you're writing a mystery genre or a romance genre or a young adult book or whatever, it's perfectly okay to leave us wondering if they get together. I don't actually want to drop any names of titles specifically because then it actually ruins it for you if you read the book. But I can think of a few really good best-selling books, young adult and adult, that actually end their novels that way. And it's not clear and it leaves us wondering. And that will actually hook your readers, especially if you intend to write a sequel. So for example, if you... Oh, okay, I won't say which book this is, but there is a young adult novel where the whole book you're like, yeah, they're going to get together and it's going to be great, and you really cheer on the two protagonists, the love interests. And then you get to the end of the book and one of them receives a letter, and all the writer says is that the letter said 3 words, and that's it. So they're not together, but you don't know if they're not together. And the 3 words, was it I miss you? Was it I love you? Was it let's be together? What is it? We don't know. So it's perfectly okay to end your novel like that, depending on how you do it. If you leave a little bit of hope that this could be an option, but also that it might not be, that's okay. That's better than flat out going, they're probably not going to be together, which will probably quite tick off your audience if you've been making them root for them the whole time. So yeah, absolutely you can do that. Just depends on how you do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. We don't have any more questions at the moment, so we might just let you go. I'm sure you've got lots of busy things to do. So thank you so much again for joining us this morning. You always bring some expert advice and tips to our community of writers out there. And I'm sure they've learnt some valuable tools this morning to help them on their writing journeys. And I really do hope, I was talking to Lisa about this earlier, that soon we can have her come into our venues in person and deliver some workshops that way. Travis is asking, when is the next lecture on writing? I will chat to Lisa about that and we can organise something hopefully very soon. And of course, our libraries are a great source of materials to assist writers. I hope you can see my image there of all the books that I found on the shelves personally yesterday and took a photo of. So we have an extensive range of non-fiction books on various aspects of writing for you to borrow, and our friendly staff can assist you in reserving titles from other libraries across the state, or you can do this from your own home using our online catalogue at the City of Marion website, in the libraries section.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you to everyone else as well. Really enjoyed reading just now some of the comments you've posted. It's really good to know that it was useful to you and that you enjoyed it. And yeah, always a pleasure presenting through City of Marion Library events. They're great staff, great people. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much, everyone, and hope you have a great weekend.
Yes, and please keep following the Marion Library's Facebook page, City of Marion website, and check your inbox to be kept up to date on all of the upcoming Library Through the Lens presentations and workshops, and those involving Lisa. And I hope you will join us again soon and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. All right. See you, everyone. Bye-bye. I'm going to try and gracefully exit from this, pretending like I know technology well.
That's okay. I'll exit you if you like, gracefully, and I hope I'll do the same. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you.